Oh, hi, hello. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby. And I am that woman, Liv. I'm here today with a very special episode. She's a character you all have requested of me a great many times, but I never felt I had the source material to really do her justice. Because, of course, this woman isn't mythological at all. Sappho was a living, breathing woman in the ancient world. A woman on the island of Lesbos in the 5th century BC, before even the great tragedians, possibly even a short 100 years or so, probably 200, after Homer himself. Sappho was the queen of Greek poetry, and she was absolutely beloved in the ancient world. Sweetbitter is a new podcast devoted to Sappho herself and her poetry, and in today's episode I spoke with hosts Alyse and Ellie. I'll also be appearing on their podcast this coming Thursday, where I've told these amazing ladies all about Aphrodite, one of Sappho's main muses. So make sure you subscribe to them to listen to that episode. But first, Sappho. Before we dive into this discussion, though, I just want to mention that when I recorded this episode, I wasn't familiar with the story of Eos that I told you last week, but I told it to you last week because of Alyse's mention of it in this episode you're about to hear, so you can thank her for that. And excuse past me for saying I didn't know it. And a quick note of apology on the quality of the audio. I am still figuring out how to properly talk to other people for this podcast. We'll get there. Episode 105, Poetess of the Ancient World, Sappho, with Alyse and Ellie of the Sweetbitter podcast. I am here today with you two from the Sweetbitter podcast. So Alyse and Ellie, thank you for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having us. We are so excited to be here.
Yes.
So why don't we start by you guys tell me about your podcast, which is how I found you and sort of the main reason we're chatting.
Yes, I will start. So we are... I am one of the hosts of Sweetbitter, which is a podcast all about Sappho. Alyse is our resident poet and has done all kinds of research. So if you want to ask any question about Sappho that anyone would ever know, Alyse can answer it.
Oh, God.
I know, sorry. Should I not have oversold that? Alyse,
All right,
Alyse can answer many questions about Sappho. Like, we'll see if there's one she can't. And Lisa and I, who's my other co-host, are there as the bridge between the layman to learn a bit more about Sappho, who we really don't learn enough about in history and who we should. So that's why we put together the podcast.
Yep.
Well, and that's exactly why I have you on, because I get asked about Sappho all the time. And like, I did my degree in classics.
Wow.
And I never learned much beyond, her name. She was a poet. And so I haven't been able to dig into too much research for my show. And then I found yours and was like, well, this means I don't have to do the research because I will just have you guys on to tell me all about her.
That's great. Wow. What do you get
it.
asked about Sappho?
Just basically to do an episode on her. I don't know if it's just out of love of ancient Greece, or if it's almost like a misconstruing of her thinking that she's mythological when of course she is very real. But also every year I try to spend the month of June doing stories centered on LGBTQIA characters in mythology. So I'm always asking for suggestions, and then Sappho comes up there.
That's so cool. I think that, one thing that's really interesting is that we're looking at her poems, and I'm approaching it as a lesbian, as a poet, as an English professor. But she makes a lot of references to different myths that I don't really understand what she's talking about. So maybe we'll have some questions for you too, Liv.
Perfect. That was basically my whole English degree, not Sappho specific, but I did a double major in English and classics, and every English class I was in, all my friends would be like, okay, well, there's another classics reference. Like, Liv, can you help us?
Help us.
Wow.
It was the most convenient double major to do because it does come up so much in, I would say, all of poetry, not so far beyond ancient Greek poetry.
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
Yes,
for sure.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about what you were talking about before too is the misconstruing Sappho as a myth, because we talk a lot about that on the show of Sappho was a real person, but there also is this retelling of her story constantly throughout history by different people rewriting her to where there is Sappho, the real person, and also there sort of is Sappho, the myth.
Totally.
Right, Alyse?
Yes, she's been mythologized in really interesting ways. I guess I should like lowercase m mythologized or whatever. Like, but I mean, you could take everything from like Plato calling her the 10th muse, to the different kind of alternate stories that different Greek playwrights wrote about her to try to account for her woman-loving womanness without being too okay with it.
They found ways of getting around so many things back then.
They sure did. Yeah.
Well, even I have read a number of Ovid's Heroines, but somehow I had forgotten that Sappho is one of them, which that's very interesting. And I actually should have just read that before this episode. Maybe I will before I release it. But I think that's so interesting because Ovid's Heroines are myths. They're mythological women, and he's written letters from them to their mythological lovers. And yet Sappho is one.
Yeah, with Phaon. Yeah, I'd love to just hear your take on that, Liv, because like we've referenced it a few times on the show, but we don't have the kind of expertise that you have. Like, what do you think's significant about that myth and Sappho being in it?
Well, I haven't read it, so the way that even came up, I actually learned because I watched the 3 plays that the Jermyn Street Theatre in London put on virtually over the past few weeks. I don't know if you caught any information about that, but they did. It was amazing. So they did these 3 plays, all based on Ovid's Heroines. It was called 15 Heroines. It was 3 plays, 5 stories in each one, and so they were all. There was 5 one woman shows in each of these plays. Yes, they were incredible. It was so well done.
So cool.
It was amazing. They were these new reimaginings, and so it was all written by women and starring women, and it was all done in the pandemic too. That's why they were one woman shows, I imagine, also because they were the Heroines, so it fit.
Oh my god!
Alyse is freaking out.
Really cool.
Yeah, it was amazing, and so they did all these reimaginings. Sappho is one of the most interesting ones, I would say, because she was a woman. She was interpreted in this play as a woman who was from, I feel like it was Trinidad and Tobago or something in and around there, like a very much colonized area. And it was presented as if she had left her home and moved to London and fallen in love with someone who then was incredibly like overbearing and lessened her. So they also made it very much about race. As if a woman who was not white moving to London and making a name for herself. And so she was like a singer who had traveled the world, but was constantly feeling lesser because of London and because of this lover. And it was all around Sappho. And it was fascinating. They were all different in such incredible ways, but that one was particularly interesting.
That's so neat. I can't wait to read that.
Yes, you really should. It was so good. The Ariadne one was unbelievable.
Oh, I bet. Ugh.
And I could go on about it forever, but it just led me to think of Sappho in a way I haven't before, just because I haven't come across her in any way. So
totally. We actually got really lucky, and we've interviewed for the show 2 different playwrights who did one actor shows of Sappho. One of them is Jade Esteban Estrada, who Out Magazine a few years back called The First Gay Latin Star. And he did this one-man show called Icons, the gay and lesbian history of the world. And he plays all these different characters, one of whom is Sappho. And then also an Australian playwright named Jane Griffiths did a play called Sappho in 9 Fragments, which is where it's a one-woman show, and she makes a lot out of the kind of fragmentation of Sappho. Her work only comes to us in fragments, of course, and Jane made that very political around like, you know, Sappho has these gaps and men have filled them in this really like colonizing, lots of overtones of rape, just like the ways that men and like male classicists and male historians have rewritten Sappho and written into the fragments in ways that are really oppressive was kind of the main focus of Jane Griffith's play. So it's so exciting to see that all of these actors are still inspired by her, you know, millennia later after her death, are still making art out of her art in response to her art. I think is one of the biggest exciting things to us in research to her, to keep finding things like that.
I do love that Sappho is so relevant now. And we also talked to Tracy Walters, who related Sappho to The Color Purple, and even some more contemporary works where there are Sappho-like characters, like the singer, songwriter type poet, because Sappho's poetry was all meant to be sung as well. So I think people know Sappho as a poet, but actually she's more of like a Lady Gaga of her time, kind of.
Yeah.
Like she's a pop star in her time, really.
Yeah, she's like, to me, she's like this blend of Taylor Swift and Lady Gaga. And we have scholars on record confirming that, so it's not the craziest idea.
I love that. My brain went to Phoebe Bridgers as an example, and then I hear Lady Gaga, and I'm like, okay, like, all right, she's sort of everything.
Yeah, Phoebe Bridgers is probably more accurate. Like singing in the corner with her lyre, like all the girls are coming over, and yeah.
But there's also this kind of like spectacle side of her that is very Gaga. Like we don't really know if she was just playing at like private drinking parties or like for private groups of women, or if she was playing at really huge religious festivals for massive crowds. We don't really know for sure which is the true story of Sappho. But if you are a believer in the idea that she played at these huge religious festivals with huge like dance lines and choruses and all of these things, then there is that feeling of Lady Gaga. Like, I mean, in her fragment 1, Ode to Aphrodite, she's like screaming up at Aphrodite in the sky, like, "There's a girl I like and she doesn't like me back. Are you gonna do something or what?" And it's very performative or something, you know, like it does feel like she's wearing a dress made of meat or something.
Ancient Greece is pretty cool, people.
Literally the entirety of my life now is ancient Greece is pretty cool, people. That kind of brings me back to, so what you're saying about the way people are still reimagining her and in all these different ways and being inspired by her. I think that that's really true of a lot of ancient Greece right now, Greek mythology specifically, but of course Sappho falls into that just because of how much she has been mythologized, like you were saying. Just because, totally. I mean, lately it seems like more and more there are these reinterpretations of Greek myth by women for women, and I am here for it. I mean, ancient Greek mythology is such a disaster of misogyny that I just think it's time. And it seems like it really is time. And I mean, I fell into it. I didn't even realize there was like this upsurge of Greek mythology. I've just been a nerd forever. And I was like, I would like to start a podcast. I think I'll make it on Greek myths. And then I ended up being part of this huge resurgence in Greek mythology. Huge. And then it being all the centric to all these women. Like there's Natalie Haynes wrote the book 1,000 Ships, which is the telling of the Trojan War and all the women in it from all of the women's point of view. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. And she's written Pandora's Jar too, which is nonfiction about these sort of misunderstood, misrepresented women in mythology. Pat Barker has written now 2 different books on the women of the Trojan War. And it just seems to be sort of endless in a way that they're like novelizing these stories, but also, you know, going into the stories themselves where it is a novelization, but at the same time deeply into the actual mythology, but sort of taken back from the men who wrote it down originally and screwed it all up for us.
It's making me think big time about this one Sappho fragment 16, where she's like doing that in her own time about home. She's just like trolling Homer in fragment 16.
Oh my God, tell me all about it.
I'll just read you the poem. This is Diane Rayor's translation. She goes, "Some say an army of horsemen, others say foot soldiers, still others say a fleet is the finest thing on the dark earth. I say it is whatever one loves. Everyone can understand this. Consider that Helen, far surpassing the beauty of mortals, left behind the best man of all to sail away to Troy. She remembered neither daughter nor dear parents as Aphrodite led her away. Unbending mind, lightly thinks, reminding me now of Anactoria gone. I would rather see her lovely step and the radiant sparkle of her face than all the war chariots in Lydia and soldiers battling in arms. Impossible to happen, human, but to pray for a share and for myself." So, like, there's some fragmentation in the middle and at the end, but this poem is pretty intact. It's one of her more intact fragments. And it's like, first of all, she's just like, all these men, all these Homers are like telling us that the sexiest stuff is like how men kill each other with spears and like these huge armies and like imperialism and like expanding Greece. But I say it's whatever you love, which feels very feminist. And then she rewrites the Helen myth. She rewrites the Helen myth as not Helen being stolen away and starting a war, but as Helen making this choice and following Aphrodite, following love, and leaving her family and going and being more beautiful than anyone in the world, and then going and leaving. And then she's like, by the way, my girlfriend Anactoria reminds me of Helen. So it's just all these layers of like badass feminist stuff. But I read it as like she's totally just like trolling Homer. Like, I don't know about all these armies and fleets. I think love is the most important thing. It's so cool.
Yeah, I love it. Because I know you had said that your audience like doesn't know too much about Sappho. If we could talk about the fragments a little bit, Alyse, because we've said, oh, her poems are in fragments, but what does that mean?
Well, and actually, before you even dive into that, I want us to also clarify for my listeners just how long ago Sappho lived, because I think that that's really important to even just what you were just saying about Homer, is that Sappho was closer to Homer than she was most of the other sources we have from ancient Greece, because she was in like the 600s BC. Is that right?
Yes, she was born sometime around 630, and then lived through 570.
So that's some of the oldest we have in terms of sources. We have, Homer and Hesiod from, we assume, the 700s or 800s BC, but the playwrights and everyone, they don't come until, Aeschylus, I think, was in the 500s, but later, and then everyone else is even later than that. So she is one of the oldest sources, which I think connects her to Homer in a way that's important, in just like understanding what time she was in and kind of the world that she was living in. But then, yes, please tell me all about the fragments and how that came about. It's partially connected to what I feel about all of ancient Greece and how we lose everything.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear about that. So the Sappho basics are that she's living in archaic Greece on the island of Lesbos. She's writing lyric poet. She's one of the very first lyric poets, meaning she's writing poems on songs that she's singing with a lyre, and she's performing them either at drinking parties or for private groups or for huge festivals. And she was so prolific that scholars believe that she probably wrote around 10,000 lines of poetry, which was collected into the Library of Alexandria in various collections. She was also just like a star. Like, Greeks just knew, in the aftermath of Sappho, Greeks just knew how to sing her songs. They just knew her greatest hits. And there's some story about this dude Solon, an Athenian poet who heard one of Sappho's songs being sung at a symposium, and he asked the boy who was singing it to teach him how to play the song. And the reason was so that I can learn it and then die. Like, that's how much her songs are crushing it, right? So she's writing all these beautiful poems, a lot of which are about love. She's really her main subject is eros, erotic desire, and she's writing about women's lives. She's the first voice ever in the world that we have an individual woman's voice, and she's our source of lyric poetry. So any kind of Taylor Swift you're listening to today harkens back to Sappho, and Sappho started that tradition. she's incredibly important. But then the tragedy is that so much of her work was lost that all that's really left is a handful of fragments, and like maybe 650 out of 10,000 lines of poetry survive, and only one complete poem. So everything else is these little fragments. And how do we find them? There's two sources. One is if an ancient teacher or rhetorician or author or something, quoted her, you would have a fragment left over that way, and like the author survived. So it could be like a grammarian trying to teach good grammar or good rhyme, and they would quote Sappho as an example. And then the other source is on papyrus scraps that have been found in these ancient trash heaps like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And so people were using papyrus, which is made from the papyrus plant on the banks of the Nile. And they were making paper and kind of just keeping your regular records there, especially like tax records and things like that. And then you wouldn't waste paper. So if you had a copy of Sappho and you didn't need it anymore, you might start writing your taxes on the back, and then you'd throw it away. And it would survive in the dry desert for thousands of years. And then most of Sappho's fragments were found in the late 19th century in the Oxyrhynchus dig. And now they're all living at, most of them are living at the Oxford Oxyrhynchus collection. And people are just kind of combing their way through those fragments and finding Sappho, recognizing like, oh, hey, this looks like Aeolic Greek. Oh, shit, this looks like the time Sappho was alive. Oh, my God, did someone writing about Eros? It's probably Sappho. So there's still lots of Sappho out there to discover. And as recently as 2004, 2014, new Sappho fragments have been found, all of which we get into on the podcast. But yeah, that's the basics of Sappho. I'm curious, like what you were going to say, Liv, about how it like gets you excited about like ancient Greece in general.
Well, so the thing I talk about all of the time is that there's so much we simply don't have, which Sappho is such a good example of that. Like all of what you were just saying, we just don't have it. It was written down, but it just didn't survive. And I don't know if this is the case for Sappho, but I do want to say, and this is one of my fun facts, is that a lot of times we have fragments of poets or playwrights because of the papyrus that you mentioned, but then it was reused and mummified small animals. It was used to mummify small animals. And then once you find those small animals, and then they found a lot of, I think, Euripides fragments from mummified crocodiles, tiny like baby crocodiles.
That's awesome. Yeah.
It's so cool.
There has been some, I think there have been some found on the crocodile sarcophagi, but more controversially, there have been some Sappho fragments found on human mummy cartonnage. And so this is something we get into on the very next couple episodes of our podcast, is this controversy around like finding a mummy mask, dipping it into like a warm water solution that kind of, because mummy masks are basically paper mache. They're made out of all these papyrus fragments, scraps that were recycled. And so if you dunk one of these things in the water, you can dilute it enough that the scraps come off, and you might find some Sappho on these mummy masks, but you're destroying an artifact in the process that was someone's burial rights, that belonged to someone's. It's like, like it would like 2,000 years from now, like somebody comes and like decomposes my grandmother's coffin just in the hopes of finding some Taylor Swift. It's very unethical, right? It's not a good practice. It kind of sucks. And then there's even been some controversy with Sappho around like, well, were these poems found in a looting situation during like the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan? Like were these poems looted? Did we send children down into tombs in dangerous situations to like find these fragments? There's tons of like ethical concerns around how we're finding Sappho and any other of these ancient poets.
Fascinating. Have you guys heard of the poet Enheduanna?
No.
Mm-mm. So she is actually the oldest poet that we have on record. She predates Sappho by like 1,500 years.
What?
She's Mesopotamian. It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Oh my God. Never heard of her. She sounds awesome.
She's really cool. I've been meaning to try to find like an actual translation. I've stumbled upon her in a couple of places, and I actually spoke to Bettany Hughes recently because she wrote a book about Aphrodite, and she was mentioning Enheduanna as well. And I'm just so motivated to actually find her stuff. But because she wasn't Greek, she's not translated that often. It's hard to find. Her language was much older and harder to translate because of it. And there's so much, Western supremacy that comes from like with why we have so much more of Greek anything than anywhere else, which is, dark as hell. But it leads to, it's really hard to find stuff like that isn't Greek. Can you tell me a bit about Sappho wrote about Eros, eroticism, and erotic love and everything, but she also wrote about specific girlfriends.
Oh, yes. We love the girlfriends. We actually, so this is the most ridiculous thing ever, but she has 3 girlfriends.
Your TikTok?
Yes, our TikTok. She has 3 girlfriends that she writes about. Attis, Anactoria, and Anactoria was in one of the fragments that Alyse read earlier, and Goggola. And we wrote a song to, what fragment was it that we did for that? To fragment 94.
94.
Where we basically were all 3 of Sappho's girlfriends singing to Sappho. And it was so ridiculous. But we do have records in her poems of her speaking about 3 different girlfriends. So when anyone, because there are some historians who would like to claim Sappho's heterosexuality, when anyone tries to do that, there is a lot of evidence in her poems about her women loving women-ness, as Alyse said.
Yeah. It gets pretty almost like outrageous. Like, so in fragment 94, which is the one that we put on togas and danced around and lip synced on TikTok, which was so fun. It's a poem about getting all like oiled up for sex, right? Like there's
anointing your love with oils and
and like laying down on the bed. And there's a line that is, you laid on a soft bed and quenched your desire. And there's at least one male scholar who interprets that line as meaning you took a nap.
Yeah, quenched your desires for sleep. Like literal sleep. But it's like, if someone said like, oh, I want to sleep with you, and you're like, oh, you just want to go to bed, like you want to just take a nap together, like that's what they're basically saying.
So yeah, I mean, pronouns have been changed in Sappho's poems to kind of conceal that they are about women, written by women. There's people will say, well, this isn't really Sappho. She's writing in a persona. She's writing in the persona of a man. But then in the middle of the poem, she'll say, I, Sappho. So it's very, so it's a pretty shaky argument that she did not, in fact, love women. Of course, we have record that she had a daughter, and being an upper class aristocratic woman, she probably would have been married to a man. But that doesn't really change what she's writing about in the poems, which is that she does spend quite a bit of her time hanging out with women in really intimate, erotic ways, and then recounting, if you believe she's writing these poems autobiographically, which I very much do, then that she's recounting this beautiful, beautiful conception of Eros in her poems. So yeah, you've got the girlfriends, you've got lots about Eros, you've got some mentions of Helen, you've got quite a few references to Aphrodite. That's her main favorite god, being a big fan of Eros, of course. And then there's a poem I wanted to ask you about, Liv, which is, there's this old age poem she has, which is about Titan. How do you say his name? And Eos, the goddess of dawn?
Eos is the goddess of the dawn. How do you spell the other one?
Tithonos. There's some myth involving eternal life without eternal youth.
Ooh.
In the poem. I was like trying to like just crash course myself on Wikipedia about this last night in preparation for our chat, but the idea just being that like, so Sappho's writing this fragment 58 about how it sucks to get old. I guess in the myth, like the goddess of dawn fell in love with a mortal and asked Zeus to give him eternal life, but she forgot to ask him to give him eternal youth. So Tithonus, he kind of he's like locked in a room somewhere, perpetually getting older and older and older, and he has lost all his memories, and his skin is like falling off of his bones, and he's ancient. And yeah, and so Sappho uses that in her poem about like, man, my knees hurt. I'm getting so old, my hair's getting gray. So she's so cute. Like she just like, you know, kind of like references all of these like religious things all the time in her poems, and all these mythical things that are it's really neat to kind of see these references pop up again and again in her work.
Well, the thing about them is, you know, in ancient Greece, it was just how they lived, especially back then when we're talking as far back as Sappho, is it's just that mythology wasn't mythology, and it wasn't a religion, it was just life. So it was like, yeah, I'm feeling old. Wow. So I mean, wow. I think Geras is the god of old age, and so they would just like call out to him. Or even when you were saying Eos, dawn, like when you're talking about the sun coming up, you are saying, well, there is Eos. They called her rosy-fingered dawn. Like, it's just, well, there's rosy-fingered dawn. She's, you know, stretching up over us. Like, it was just the light. It was the way life was. It's just fascinating. And that's obviously why I'm so deeply obsessed with it all. But it was just like, of course, yeah, you're just singing to those people because that's what you did. It's like, I don't know. Well, it might be too early even for maybe this, but Erato is the muse of erotic poetry, and so I wonder if that appears in any of Sappho. But it's sort of she's from so long or so far back that the mythology wasn't standardized either. So not everybody, based on their region, like believed the same thing or had all the same gods, or especially the muses. The muses are kind of a funny group with that.
Yeah,
and Lesbos is so far too. I find that fascinating.
She gives a lot of shout outs to Aphrodite, and she does. It's funny that you mentioned the rosy fingered dawn, because right here I'm looking at again Diane Rayor's translation of Sappho's fragment 58, and she goes, "My spirit has grown heavy, knees buckle that once could dance light as fawns. I often groan, but what can I do? Impossible for humans not to age." And then she says, "For they say rosy-armed dawn, in love, went to the ends of earth holding Titanus, beautiful and young. But in time, gray old age seized even him with an immortal wife." And I just love the kind of casual reference to like, well, I mean, even this guy who married a freaking goddess couldn't help but get old. Like, there's no way out of this. I'm just like doomed to get really old.
Even though I'm Sappho, you know, even Sappho has to age.
We read this really great, the intro to this book called Sappho's Lyre, which is all about the different archaic lyric and women poets of ancient Greece, by Diane Rayor. And in the intro, I really wanted to know your take on this, Liv, because in the intro, who's writing the foreword? Some classicist is writing the foreword. W.R. Johnson, and he's talking about like the kinds of people the ancient Greeks were, and he was talking about how they would see us today as like kind of barbaric because we're so stupid. Like we don't all just know how to sing and recite poetry and debate and like and we don't have these like beautiful bodies that are like completely like, you know, in beautiful shape, and like they would just kind of see us as slaves because we only know how to do one thing, and we're just like have like specialized interests, and they would see that as like really disappointing.
Yeah, I mean, we are barbaric, but what actually that leads me to my favorite fun fact that I tell everyone is the word barbaric and barbarism comes from the ancient Greek, and it originally just meant people who didn't speak Greek.
So we all are. Oh, well, at least I am. I can't speak Greek.
We are all barbarians.
Wow.
So we've taken that word to now mean something bad, and they did mean it. They meant it bad, but they meant it bad, you know, in a xenophobic way, not in a like violent way. Like they were just xenophobic, like everyone, especially everyone in the Western world. But yeah, so they just they thought very poorly of people who didn't speak Greek, and they called them barbarians, and they viewed them that way. And it comes up in a few specific myths too, where they would like they would make certain particularly violent characters like from places that weren't Greece. Like they thought quite poorly of people from Thrace often, and they were not poorly, but they were always like violent and war torn. And there's just some darkness associated with that because they weren't Greek, and all the dark stories that go along with Medea are because she was meant to be not Greek, and she was meant to be a barbarian as well.
Wow, I never knew that.
It's one of my most favorite facts.
I can see why.
I feel like this is it's a fragmented conversation we're having, but it's fascinating.
It's great. Yeah, great.
It's very Sappho-like.
Totally.
So what is some of the most fun things you've covered on the podcast? Like, have you learned any particularly exciting facts and that you want to impart?
We've learned a lot of very interesting facts. One of my favorite ones was when we talked to Diane Rayor, who we've mentioned a million times because she's one of the best Sappho translators out there. But we talked to her about
I'm ordering her books right now.
Yes.
So good. And she's also just so passionate about Sappho. When you talk to her, I almost cried when we talked to her because she was so eloquent about the impact that Sappho had on her and her life's work. It was really beautiful. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was one of the fragments, which Alyse sort of alluded to earlier. There is one word that's a gerund in it. And so some people, pretty much before Diane, have translated that phrase as for love of a boy, because the word means, it just means child in Greek. It just means like a young person. But there was a gerund that she found that had a feminine connotation. And so she used the feminine gerund to turn it into for love for a girl. And I just thought it was so interesting that one word can change everything, and just how important the translation is from bringing, obviously, fragments to somebody who can actually translate Greece, and then taking that translation. And so how much Sappho we know has changed over time because of how people translate her, but also how, like, if you do translate her correctly, it's super gay, and I love it. That's all.
Well, but that's the thing about everything from ancient Greece is that translations are so subjective. They're so subjective, and it just depends kind of on the thoughts and feelings of the person translating it. Like, I know there's a lot of instances of old translations of Homer where the women are often depicted as, like, the word is that's translated into English as like slut or something of the like, but really it was just like some variation on the word for woman. Like, it was, yeah. So God. It's just like this sort of, it's just insane prejudice and misogyny, and then we're like, we learn this the whole time. Or even, I mean, I'm constantly referring to however many different translations I can find of something, because my biggest thing in the podcast is understanding consent, or typically complete lack thereof, in Greek mythology. But because everything we have was written down by men, they wouldn't necessarily actually phrase it like the way that it was believed, or the way that it was believed by the women in the world. And often it's like, you can just assume for the most part that when it comes to the gods, like, there was no consent, but the men writing the story didn't care, so they didn't write it down like that. Or if they did and it was, subtle, and then it wasn't translated as such. And there's so many different ways you can understand something, and I tend to try to find translations by women whenever I can, because it makes a world of difference.
But it just like is so fascinating to me, because obviously it's like this ancient game of telephone, and we're getting the final answer through the lens of so many different people, and like you said, also a lot of men. And so it's really been interesting to get as many perspectives as we can from women as well.
Yeah, and like we've learned a lot about it's very disappointing, right, that we only have 600 fragments left out of 10,000 lines of poetry, but at the same time, it's miraculous that we have even that. It's miraculous that we have even that because I mean, it's 2 millennia old, so it's like, massively old, and it's been found in the desert and in trash heaps, but also like the only reason that it would have survived long enough to even be written down the way it was that people really loved it, even though at the time lyric poetry was kind of not really the thing. It wasn't as great as epic poetry. People weren't really as into it as epic poetry. And women poets, I mean, it was like a woman writing, it was like a dog walking on its back legs. Like it was just insane. So if you were like, if you were like a teacher in classical Greece or in Rome, you wouldn't teach a woman poet, and like you wouldn't do that because and she was pagan, right? So once Christianity started spreading, her work is getting burned. And so the reason her work's getting burned, right, at like in like the medieval times when Christianity is spreading, is not so much that it's sexual, because like we know that like like Gregory VII didn't burn the pornographic poems of Martial. So it wasn't that there was sex in it. It's that it was women writing, and that it was women writing about loving other women. And erotic poetry is far more threatening to the order. It's far more radical than pornographic poetry, because erotic poets are singing about the soul, and they're singing about the reverence of the self and the other, and the reverence of desire and hope and joy, and all these things are much more transcendent than just like sex and like pornographic descriptions like you'd have in Martial or even Catullus. So I think that's really interesting to like keep reading about how important and radical her work is and was and has been, and how it's so miraculous that it survived even in the form that we have today.
Yeah, everything that we have it's so interesting how it survived. It's always such a saga for how much work it took for something to survive to where we have it now. Because so much, between Christianity and then just time, it's a real mess of trying to keep pagan writings still around.
Christianity and time, the most difficult things to fight against.
I have another fun fact that like ties into something like this really interesting, like this feels like a historical Easter egg, but we just have so much bias in the translations. And so the first woman to edit Sappho is in 1937. It takes that long, right? And her name, she's an Italian papyrologist, and guess what her name is? It's Medea Norsa.
Wow.
Oh, that's just fun. I like that.
Alyse, do you want to talk a little bit too about the actual myth of Sappho? Like what types of myths were being perpetuated about her after her death?
Ooh.
So Ovid writes the Heroines. He's a Roman poet, and he writes in there that Sappho fell in love with Phaon, the mythological ferry boat driver, captain. I don't know what we call ferry boat people, but
he's just the ferryman.
Ferryman. That's the word. Yeah. Oh my god, I'm so tired. Ferryman. So she falls in love with him, right? And she falls in love with him so hard that when he rejects her, because according to Ovid, Sappho was short, dark. That's the word he uses, and ugly. And so when Phaon rejects Sappho, she throws herself off a cliff to her death. And that's one of the myths of Sappho. Totally, it's like Ovid made it up, right? He wrote it down in the Heroines. And so there's also just like there's Plato calling her the 10th muse. So there's this kind of like mythology of her being this incredibly gifted poet, akin to the gods. And then there's just there's this two Sapphos idea where the classical Greeks who come after Sappho and the Romans, they can't get it in their heads that someone who wrote such beautiful poetry would also have had 3 girlfriends. And like, then because like we start getting really anxious about, gay stuff as time goes on. And so they made up this.
Do we?
Never heard of it.
Just wait listen to what they did. This is the craziest thing. They're like, okay. Here's what we think happened. There were 2 Sapphos. Okay. First Sappho was the legendary poet, 10th muse, the poetess, this incredible like cultural figure whose face we've put on money because she's like a cultural icon and we love her. Sappho number 2 was a lesbian whore, but she wasn't just like, she slept with women, but she also like gave really good blowjobs, and she would just like put it out there for anybody. And the other Sappho is this incredible disreputable woman. That was their answer.
That sounds about like Ancient Grace.
Yeah.
They made plays about her where she was like a stock figure in classical comedies. She was the laughing stock like slut, to the point where the island of Lesbos became synonymous with folks who give good blowjobs. That was how much of a stock cliche she became as this slut, because of this anxiety around her just writing sexy poems about girls. Like it's actually crazy.
Yeah. It's wild. Like, it's like thinking about like Sappho being in high school and she's like a high school lesbian and people are like, we can't handle this. And they start rumors about her. It's too much.
Yeah. Being a like slutty, like giver of blowjobs. Like they heterosexualize her and they call her ugly. And it's like all of this at once just to try to mitigate this anxiety that she was writing beautiful poems about loving women. Like it was too much.
There's a lot of bending over backwards to try to make people acceptable to any of those nonsensical ideals they had at any given time.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think that's why we don't really learn too much about Sappho in history classes. Like I learned all about Homer, but didn't learn about Sappho. And I think it's because like she's too controversial. I think even now people are like, oh, well, how will we teach children this, When it's like she's a pretty amazing historical figure, yet we're not learning about her.
She's great for high schoolers because her most famous fragment is fragment 31, and it just describes my entire 4-year high school experience, like to a T. I mean, maybe it's just because I was like a closeted young lesbian, but in fragment 31, she describes the physical agony that is watching the girl she likes talking to a guy, and she can't, like, the jealousy and the erotic desire that she's feeling is causing is having a catastrophic impact on her physical body. Like she's melting, she's sweating, and like there's like a rushing sound in her ears, and she's going blind, and she feels like she's shaking, she's having a seizure. She's so upset by watching this girl talk to this guy, and I'm like, yeah, I got that. Like #same.
I also just want to use this as a way to get people to listen to you. So if there's anything...
I mean, I think we've done a pretty good conversation about who she was, what's interesting about her. But what I would say is like the reason to listen to Sweetbitter is that if you are into the kind of ancient Greek things and into the myths and into all of that, you're going to get a lot of that. And we just... we're just learning so much. We've talked to scholars from around the world. We are talking to people in French. We're talking to Australian papyrologists and American performance artists and playwrights and musicians and writers and translators and everything in between. And we've learned so much about, translation and what ancient Lesbos was like, what it was like to be, like what their norms around sexuality were in archaic Greece and archaic Lesbos. We've learned about a legal scandal involving some theft of papyri from the Oxford collection by, allegedly, an Oxford professor.
Ooh.
Yeah, the scandal is going to be a good one. It's coming. Yeah.
And then we've learned about just like what Sappho's resonance is today with things like the color purple, or with even like musicians today who are continue to be inspired by her work. So it's pretty far-ranging material, and we've just talked to some really generous, interesting people. Would be my last like gesture of plugging the podcast.
Yeah. So how did you guys get so deep into that? Like, it sounds like your podcast is pretty new, and then I'm just impressed and jealous of your drive and your ability to talk to so many people so quickly. That's so incredible. It sounds like you've got such exciting stuff coming.
Yes. In terms of how we got started, I've had my own podcast for the past 4 years. It's called Les Hang Out. So I was in the podcasting world for a bit. So recording and all that kind of stuff, that's my job. So I love doing the audio stuff. Lisa, who's our producer, heard Alyse on another podcast. It's called Buffering the Vampire Slayer, all about Buffy. So Alyse was on there to talk about Sappho, and Lisa heard her, and I think had the thought that I think most people will have when they hear this episode of, why have I never heard about Sappho before? Or why have I barely heard about Sappho and I don't know enough? And she just wanted to learn more. And so she pulled us all together. We worked for a very long time compiling the actual interviews before we put together the podcast itself. We probably got started in our pre-production in March, and then we launched in October. So we've been talking to people for months before we even released our first episode. And I think we just shot our shot. We picked the people we thought would be really cool to talk to, and we just emailed them. And I think because Sappho is, number one, so cool, and number two, not talked about enough, anyone who loves Sappho that we reached out to was so happy to talk to us because they wanted to share this information. And then as we're, compiling all this stuff, we realized there really is a lot of material here. So we're planning an 8-episode series. I think we might actually have more episodes because we have so much content. I would say Lisa, as our producer, really pulled us together and kept us motivated. And Alyse, as a professor herself and a poet, had the research down. So I think the three of us kept each other moving forward, which has been a really nice team.
Yeah, we have very different skill sets and experience and background, but we work really great together. And it's just, it doesn't feel like work to me reading Sappho's poems or reading articles about her or learning about her, and then getting to talk to these really generous sources who have dedicated their lives, especially in Diane's case, dedicated her life to translating this woman's work and bringing it to the public. So we're just glad that we can then popularize it and make it more accessible, I guess, to a non-academic audience or a non-historic audience, which is exactly what you're doing with your awesome podcast too, Liv. So you know all about that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, that's so incredible. I'm just, I'm in awe that you were so prepared and did so much work leading up. It's one of those things I never do anything ahead of time in my podcast, and I deeply wish I did. I'm just very impressed. But that's so exciting that you got to talk to so many people and learn so much about this person. I'm so glad I found your guys' podcast and asked to have you on here today. I've learned so much too.
Right back at you. I'm starting to make my way through your back catalog, and it's just awesome stuff. I'm learning so much. My mind is blown by all these things that are so old, but also feel so contemporary at the same time.
Oh God, don't they? That's my favorite. They're the best. So, well, then thank you both for coming on here today. But most importantly, where can everyone listen to your podcast?
Yes, you can find Sweetbitter anywhere you get your podcast. You're going to want to look up Sweetbitter, a Sappho podcast. And if you look up all of those words, you will definitely find us. Easiest way to find us is at sweetbitterpodcast.com, and that has all of our links as well. And all of our social media handles are at sweetbitterpod. Oh, also, I feel like we barely even mentioned this, so I just need to we do songs every episode, which is really fun. So we write original songs. Well, they're original, but they're based on Sappho fragments. So we write the melodies, but we are using the lyrics of Sappho to write a new song in a different contemporary genre every week. And that's been really fun. We've done disco so far, which was my favorite. We've done a pop type song. We've done jazz. We've got some country coming up. We've got power ballads. We got it all. It's going to be great.
That is so much fun. I'm very glad you remembered to mention it. What an extra exciting bit.
It's so ridiculous, but I'm a musician, and Lisa is also a singer, and so is Alyse. Alyse is in a band as well. So we were just we have to do this. We can't make this podcast and not make music together.
It's cool to get to sing her work because that's how it was intended to be heard. And so anytime that you are singing Sappho or listening to a musical version of Sappho, although we don't know the melodies of what her songs would have actually sounded like, just experiencing them with music to them, I think is closer to what they would have felt like 2,500 years ago. And so that it's really a fun thing that we get to do.
Yeah, it's so important given that's exactly how she would have done it back then.
Yeah.
Not necessarily as a power ballad or country.
Yeah, not necessarily the genre,
but it felt like contemporary to her time, right? Like to her people, it felt like pop. It felt like, the top 40 or whatever. Mm-hmm. So we're capturing the like vibe of it feeling very new and and contemporary, which I love, because it does sound pretty stinking old when you hear reenactments of people trying to sing in Aeolic Greek on the lyre. You're like, what is this?
Also, I love like we did one where it's a fragment and it basically ends, like the fragment ends the actual poem and it sort of leaves you hanging. And so the last song we did leaves you hanging completely. And it's just like the stupidest Sappho joke that really like sent me over the edge.
All right. Well, now we've been chatting half nonsense and half incredible Sappho stuff for over an hour, so I will let you both go. But thank you so much for coming on here.
Oh man, Liv, thanks so much for having us. Yeah, it was so nice to get to meet you, and I hope that someday we can meet in person and have a beer and talk about Sappho. And
I would absolutely love that. Nerds, thank you all for listening to that. This was one of the greatest conversations I've had for this podcast, and also one I've just been meaning to have forever. I really wanted to know more about Sappho, and so when this opportunity came up, I jumped at it. Seriously, I saw there was a new Sappho podcast and sent them a DM within 30 seconds. I just think it's so perfect. I hope you loved Sappho as much as she deserves to be loved. I mean, a woman that long ago who was that famous for writing poetry in ancient Greece, it's fucking badass. And then, of course, talking with Ellie and Alyse was incredibly fun, as you just heard, because half of it was just us getting along super well. It was really fun. I hope you had as much fun as we did. Please make sure you listen to the Sweetbitter podcast. I'm going to be on there just in a couple of days from when this episode airs, talking all about Aphrodite. And if you can believe it, that conversation was even more fun than this one. So please subscribe to the Sweetbitter podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. You will not regret it. Thank you all for listening. I am Liv, and I love this shit.